Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, with the book by Bert Shevelov and Larry Gelbart, music and lyrics by Stephen Sondheim. So I'm not really a musicals person. I love theater. I've been involved in a healthy amount of community theater over the past couple of years. I'm a scholar of drama. I'm not really a musicals person. It's not something that I'm interested that much in, whatever it is, right? But Sock Buskin, the community theater company that I primarily work with, is doing A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum as our first ever musical. And I'm working on lighting for it, and I wasn't planning on auditioning, but I might, having now read the play, because there's a couple of characters that I think would be quite fun to do, but we'll see. I also don't sing, so that really substantially limits the possibilities. Anyway, but that's not what I'm here to talk about. So the play itself, I think, is a really interesting one because it sort of draws on the traditions of Roman comedy from people like Plautus and Terence, particularly Plautus, who has at least one, and I think more than one, play in which the cunning slave is Pseudolus, which is the name of the cunning slave in Forum. And it's really cool. It's really cool because so you can sort of trace the evolution of dramatic comedy. And when I say dramatic, I mean like theater, right? Not drama, not in the way that you would classify a movie as a dramatic film, whatever, right? You know what I mean, right? So you can sort of trace this you go from somebody like Aristophanes, who is a writer in what's called Old Comedy, this Greek approach to comedy, 4th century BCE Athens, 5th century BCE Athens, and it's very political, it's very timely, it deals with these sort of big ideas and sort of ridiculing people, mocking people, criticizing people. It's closer to a satire. And then as you move later out of sort of the golden age or the classical age of Athenian society into more sort of the Hellenistic period, 4th century, 3rd century BCE, you move from old comedy to what's called middle comedy, which we don't know a massive amount about. There is one example that's of an Aristophanes play that's regarded as middle comedy, but then you move into what's called new comedy. And Menander is the one who Menander is the person who the largest body of his work survives, right? So we have more plays, almost a complete text, and then a bunch of fragments of varying degrees of completion from Menander. So we have more from him than any other new comic playwright. And new comedy is this very sort of formulaic approach that deals with stock, or that utilizes stock characters like the greedy old man, the bragging soldier, the young couple of lovers, the male lover and the female lover who want to get together, the cunning slave, etc., right? These stock figures, they get carried through into Roman comedy. Again, people like Plautus and Terence, who write Roman comedies, use these same kinds of figures, and then they get transformed into the stock figures of the Commedia dell'arte in later Italian, and it sort of spreads to France especially, but Commedia dell'arte performance picks this up. you see some of the same kinds of things, some of the same kinds of stock characters and plot lines of like the young lovers are separated for some reason, and the greedy old man or the braggart soldier or whoever it is pursuing the young female love. You have all of these different kinds of characters and cunning slaves or cunning servants or whatever it is, depending on the cultural context. So these things get sort of carried through. And you see these in some plays by, say, Shakespeare and other early modern English playwrights. You see some of them in French classical drama with people like Moliere, for instance, utilizes some of these same types of things, and even into the modern era, right? Contemporary comedies often utilize similar basic storylines, although we tend today to be less on board with characters that are clearly stock characters. But Forum utilizes characters that are clearly stock characters, right? So Pseudolus is very, very obviously the cunning slave, the slave who primarily wants his freedom, and he uses his wits to attempt to get it. Hero is the young male love, and there's not much to him other than that. Philia is the young female love, and there's not much to her other than that, right? So these are people whose role it basically is to be beautiful and for us to root for them to get together at the end of the play. You have Miles Gloriosus, the braggart soldier who is pursuing the young, beautiful virgin Philia. You have Senex. We just did a read-through of Forum. The production team did, and I read for Senex. He's a lot of fun. But you have Senex, who is Hero's father, but also sort of the older, sort of henpecked guy with a sort of domineering wife. So there's a little bit of like, this may or may not be the sort of most widely recognizable reference, but the bouquets in Keeping Up Appearances, right? There's a little bit of sort of like a yes, dear type vibe to him, but then he ends up in this situation where he believes that for whatever reason he is being pursued by Philia, and he's going after her as well, right? So this is sort of the central thing, is the play itself revolves around this central question of who gets Philia. And in some ways that's quite a problematic approach to it, right? Because, I mean, let's be upfront about this. The play is not sensitive, put it that way. Like, there is a lot of problematic stuff in this. And I forget what year this came out, but I think it was in the 70s, and so sensibilities were not quite good all the time. But, like, there's a lot of jokes about... there's a lot of jokes about women. There's a lot of jokes about same-sex desire or identities or behavior or whatever it is. There's a lot of like dirty old man-driven plot lines and things like this, all of which is problematic. But again, it was stuff that would be very standard in the comedies of the 70s, like sitcoms and things like this ran on these types of plot lines all the time. So it's not like Chevalov, Gelbert, and Sondheim were doing something crazy. They were doing something very, very standard, and they were putting it into this basic structure that goes back to Roman comedy, and they were sort of announcing the relationship of Forum with Roman comedy through the fact that it's set in Rome and through the name of Pseudolus as the cunning slave, right? And so, Philia is in the house of Marcus Lycus, who owns and operates basically a brothel slash human trafficking service. He distributes female slaves. It also seems like it is a functional brothel, and they are sex workers as such, but also you can purchase them permanently. So it's just, there's, I guess, a multifaceted human trafficking service. So Philia has ended up in the house of Marcus Lycus. She has been sold to Miles Gloriosus, again, this braggart soldier who's this sort of big war hero, etc., etc. He's going to show up at some point and pick her up to marry her or whatever it is. But Hero, the son of Senex and Domina, has fallen in love with Philia, and so he strikes a bargain with his slave, Pseudolus, that if you can get me this girl, Philia, I will give you the thing that you want most in the world, which is your freedom. Pseudolus is so desperate for his freedom that he agrees to this. And one of the cool things about Pseudolus in basically any of his iterations, whether that is in the works of Plautus or in Forum, is that Pseudolus flies by the seat of his pants, right? He does not come up with, here is a solid long-term plan. He says, all right, here's the situation in front of me. How do I beat this objective, right? And everything ends up coming together at the end. So the trick basically becomes, how does Pseudolus get Philia away from Miles Gloriosus? How does he get her away from this person who has paid 500 minae for her? How does he get her away with Lycus being very aware that Miles is coming to pick her up? How does he overcome the fact that Philia is unwilling to run away with Hero and just sort of go off, elope, and live together, etc., etc.? And then how does he deal with the fact that Senex is now pursuing her as well, right? He's also trying to deal with Hysterium, who is the sort of head slave of Senex and Domina. And Hysterium is sort of constantly panicking. He's constantly tense and on edge, and is sort of strangely both opposed to and the partner in crime of Pseudolus, at points basically being like, stop, I'm going to tell on you, and at other points taking these risks to help Pseudolus with the plan. So, I mean, that's sort of the shtick of it overall, right? It is this competition over the possession of this woman, Philia. And again, from the sensibility of people who see women as human beings, very problematic. From the perspective of, we can set aside the troubling gender politics, which I'm reluctant to do, but from that perspective, it is quite funny, because again, it draws on these very old, very established comic traditions, going back to people like Menander, Plautus, and Terence, built through the Commedia dell'arte, built through the early modern drama in places like England and France up to the present day, right? And again, in sort of the 18th century, 19th century, these sort of like Renaissance, these sort of like Rococo dramas, Rococo comedies, Restoration comedy in England, up into the 19th century. You have this long comic tradition utilizing and sometimes reimagining, refining all of these comic elements. And Shevelov, Gelbart, and Sondheim are in that tradition.